Hello, I'm Marco Ramelli. Today I would like to talk about the compositional world of Federico Mompou, one of the great Spanish, or rather Catalan, composer of the last century. We have just listened to a composition part of an intimate poetic collection of works for solo piano called Musica Callada. Today I will talk a bit about his piano music, his guitar compositions, but my real focus will be on his approach to sound. Mompou is a composer that I really love. Discover his poetic has inspired me for several years and moved me in my personal sound research. Looking at his artistic approach to sound interpretation can also give some important suggestions to us guitarists. Mompou was very mysterious and a shy character, an extremely sensitive and genuine composer and pianist, a unique and fascinating figure in the 20th century music world. His music reflects his life, solitary and devoted to introspection, in which the music was used as a medium to connect with his spiritual world. I hope that with today's meeting to intrigue you and make you want to discover more about him, his life, and the composition that he wrote for our instrument. In the last part of this talk I will also focus on the guitarist and composer Miguel Llobet, a great guitarist, friend of Mompou, and who shared with him several artistic aspects. In the meeting that I will follow, it will be then possible to discuss with you more about Llobet and the similarity and differences between him and Mompou. Let's start with the place where these two composers were born. Both of them are Catalan, and they lived an essential part of their life in Barcelona. And at the beginning of the century, the Catalan capital had one of the most vibrant cultural scenes. I think it is really beneficial for us as guitarists to know a little bit about Catalan cultural context between the two centuries. It helps us to understand what context much of our music was born. And maybe we can also get some extra inspiration in our interpretation. So, from the 18th century, Catalonia lost his autonomy and started to be part of the Kingdom of Spain. And Spain imposed to Catalonia to renounce his law and the language. However, those impositions coming from above could not nullify the Catalan identity and the use of the language. The language remained alive and it was also used for the singing of folk songs, carrying out this important tradition of popular songs. We will see that this aspect will be crucial in the compositional research of Mompou and Llobet. We see a formal re-emerging of the Catalan national identity, more public re-emergence, in what we call Catalan Renaissance during the Romanticism. But it's between the two centuries that we see a real cultural revolution with the modernist movement. Barcelona became one of the most culturally dynamic cities in Europe, with a very wealthy bourgeoisie who was willing to invest in culture. Modernism was part of a general trend that emerged in Europe around the turn of the 20th century. In Catalonia, the movement acquired its unique personality. It It was a progressive movement that started with literature and architecture, but then incorporated all the arts. The music was also part of this movement, with at the beginning two great composers like Albéniz and Granados, and then a long list of composers followed them. So art and culture became a visible manifestation of the Catalan people character, and who had not been able to express politically, and they were culturally repressed for centuries. The guitar played a central role in this time. It's quite a special moment for the guitar. It was an instrument associated with the national identity. So it's not a great surprise to see how guitarist Llobet, Sáenz de la Maza, but also before Targa, they were very close friends with great composers like Albéniz, Granados, Falla, but also poets as García Lorca or painters and sculptors. So Mompou and Llobet were born in a very fertile context, where artists were deeply connected. So we can see also how many musicians also cultivate other artistic passion. Both Llobet and Mompou developed passion for drawing and painting. Actually, Llobet started his artistic path as painter. Mompou continued during his life to do sketches and paintings, and they also had a lot of closer relationships with poets and writers. It was in this context that Mompou was born in 1893 in Barcelona, just 15 years after Miguel Llobet. Mompou began to study in Barcelona with Serra, piano, and is in 1909, after listening to a composition by Gabriel Fauré, the Quintet Opus 89, that he decided to train as a composer. So, when he was 16, he decided to continue his studies in composition and piano in Paris. It was quite common for Catalan artists to go to Paris to study. Also, Llobet at the beginning of the century went to live in Paris for a while. This common practice was also quite crucial for the development of the Barcelona cultural life. So all the artists that went to Paris and then came back to Barcelona, they brought from abroad the new artistic tendency developed in Europe. Llobet went the first time in Paris thanks to the invitation of the great pianist Vinesse. Mompou instead arrived in France with a letter of recommendation written by the famous composer and pianist Enrique Granados, that was the head of the conservatory in Barcelona. And the letter was addressed to Fauré, director of the Conservatory of Paris. Mompou, for his timidity and modesty, never showed the message to the conservatory director, and he was accepted only as pianist and not composer. This one is one of the many examples that show the humbleness and timidity of Mompou, that many times reject invitation or didn't do project because his shyness. In 1914, with the First World War, Mompou had to return to his homeland, where he stayed until the end of the war. But then, after, in 1921, he decided to go back to Paris. During this first part of his career, he becomes very recognized as pianist. But his teachers were on the one hand very impressed by his talent, but also a little bit sorry for his reluctance to perform and to show his talent. Also, as a composer, he was very insecure and he didn't want to publish any work. It's thanks to his friend Augustin Quintas that he published his first work, Chant Magique, in 1920. The piece had a great recognition from colleagues and critics, and it was only the beginning of his compositional career. During his life, he had much recognition despite his humbleness. In particular, many renowned pianists recorded his music. I can mention Alicia de la Roca, Michelangelo, Rubinstein. Despite the success that he is having in Paris, he decided to come back to Barcelona and live a very quiet life. Now I would like to play for you the first movement of Chant Magique. So Mompou wrote mainly for piano. He needed a deeper connection with the instrument for composing. A similar approach we can see also in Llobet and his Torres guitar. Through the relationship with the instrument and the sound that is the instrument produces, the composer is able to get the inspiration. It is funny that in one interview he also mentioned that he loves to compose when he's distracted. And in that interview he said that he wrote his prelude for left hand while he was talking with dear friend Miguel Llobet.
Incluso estando distraído, puedo llegar a concebir algo.
Más que si se concentra.
Más que si me concentro.
Curioso.
Y esto me ocurrió como ejemplo, puedo decir, en el preludio de la mano izquierda. Estaba yo en París, estaba en mi casa el guitarrista Miguel Llobet y estábamos charlando animadamente, él estaba aquí y hablando. Y yo naturalmente tenía la mano en el piano, hablando. Hasta un momento que oigo esto.
As Llobet, he rarely composed pieces for other instruments. He wrote almost all only for piano, with a few exceptions, and likely for us, he wrote also for guitar. I think that in his melancholic and evocative sound of the guitar, Mompou identified a perfect medium to express his complex poetic world, in which sound and silence assume evocative values. Already in 1920, the guitarist Requino Sáenz de la Maza sensed this connection with the guitar and presented the transcription of one movement of Impressiones Intimas in a concert in Paris. Mompou composed the guitar only after Andrés Segovia. The two met in Santiago de Compostela, where Mompou taught, and where Segovia held summer courses. Thanks to this friendship, one of the most important works written for the Spanish virtuoso was composed in 1962, the Suite Compostelana, a six-movement piece emblematic of the composer's style. The material used by Mompou in this piece is original, except from the last movement, that is expressively inspired by the Muñeira de Lugo, a typical Galician dance, usually played on a form of bagpipe. Maybe now we can listen this last movement. Mompou also composed 15 canciones and dances between the 1918 and 1972, and the collection is almost entirely written for piano, with the exception of the number 13 that is written for guitar and the number 15 that is for organ. And in 2001, Angelo Gilardino discovered also a transcription made by the composer of the Canzoni Danza number 10 in the Andrés Segovia archive. While other Catalan composers decided to be part of the modern musical movement, Mompou decided to write mainly slowly and nostalgic pieces. For example, the one that we just listened to today. And this approach was very different from other of his colleagues. They were writing also virtuosistic music. But I think that this approach was deeply connected with the rich musical tradition of Catalonia, where the feeling or the emotion of nostalgia is always present in the folk songs. Mompou described his musical style as a sort of start over, trying to go back to the music that was written in the past. It's going back to an archaic use of the music, some kind of primitive music. Nevertheless, we can see many influences of Mompou composition. We can identify three primary sources of inspiration. The first one is the sound of the bells, the second one is the French music, and then the Catalan folk tradition. So the first influence can be found in the childhood, that is connected with the sound of the bells. Mompou families had a bell factory, and he always was fascinated by the ringing sonority of the bells. And the bell sound can be seen as a feature that can be seen in a lot of composition of Mompou. In particular, the bells produce a very clear series of overtones. And in Mompou music, we can identify the use of this series, and in particular the intervals of fourth, fifth, and octaves. His teacher in the conservatory really obstructed his use for octaves, perfect fifth and perfect fourth. And the real change in Mompou composition became when, using Mompou's own words, he decided to use his own instinct, imagination, and intelligence as only guide for being a composer. And now I will show you a small example of a use of the harmonic series and the sound of the bell. The second important source of inspiration can be found in Catalan folk music. This aspect is perfectly connected with the general movement that I told you, that started with the Renaissance of Catalonia during the Romanticism, and then continues with the Modernism. And both Mompou and Llobet, they were really curious to discover the folk music, and they wrote two of their most important work inspired by Catalan songs. Mompou wrote 15 songs and dances, and Llobet also a series of canciones populares catalanas that are a milestone in our repertoire. The folkloric element that is so strongly present in the music of Mompou was a sort of starting point for the composer. A material that was used to create a connection with the past, and so to realize the idea of primitive music. Also, this attention to the folklore can be seen as a way to create this idea of pure music, so music that is not affected by the filter of the composer. In many writings, Mompou wrote that his music is the last composed ever, or that his only desire was to write works in which nothing is missing and nothing is superfluous. I would like to play for you now just two extracts of two Catalan folk songs. One arrangement written by Mompou and played by Michelangelo, that gave perfectly the idea of the approach of Mompou with this music. And the second one is another folk song arranged for guitar by Miguel Llobet. In this last song that we listen, it's very clearly to see how the French music inspired Llobet with a use, sort of impressionistic use of the harmony. And the French music was also a source of inspiration of Mompou. He deeply admired works by Fauré, Eric Satie, and Claude Debussy. He said that he never composed like Debussy, despite some similarity. But he said that for Mompou, Debussy was composing for two persons, not three. But he was composing only for one. So this idea was not to compose pieces for concert hall, but almost compositions that were made only for the player. In this sense, we can see his music as a sort of prayer that helped to connect to the spiritual world. Nevertheless, he shared a lot of elements with some composers of the French area, such, for example, Satie. He often abandoned the use of development, key signature, time signature, and bar line, as Satie. But he's doing that to create this sense of simplicity. Here, for example, an example of the beginning of the composition of Musica Halal. I would like to talk about interpretation and about Mompou as interpreter. So the element of inspiration and the strong connection with the instrument and this ability to listen the connection between notes, they were essential element in his composition, but also in his interpretation of the music. In composing and performing, Mompou creates a very intimate and profound relationship with the instrument and the sound. For example, in his music, especially in the maturity, there is no sign of dynamics. In his book on interpretation, Mompou wrote that it must be the interpreter's sensitivity and his perception to guide him. But it doesn't imply a complete freedom left to the interpreter. It is more an invitation to the performer to connect with the music, to perceive the intensity necessary to play the note. So playing his music requires to the interpreter to enter in his poetic world, and in some way in his spiritual view of the music. In this regard, one of the most fascinating aspects of Mompou performance technique, which is strongly linked with the compositional one, is the ability to connect sound. And I think that is something that is also in common with Llobet. So Mompou's view contradicts the theory that say that in the piano, when after you press the key and after the hammer hit the string, the sound is out of the player's control. But indeed, for him, is in this moment that the instrumental or the interpreter can work on the sound. It doesn't explain exactly what the interpreter have to do. But I will play for you a very short section of an interview that he gave to a television. Unfortunately, this interview is in Spanish, but it's very interesting to see him playing. And in this small example, Mompou showed a little bit about his researching and how he's trying to perceive how the note gives its greatest energy, not when he presses the key or when the hammer hits the string, but a little bit after. And his research is to hear and to reach the exact moment the note reaches maximum energy, and then it passes to the next one. So in this example also, Mompou said that in his research is not focused on one note or the timbre of the sound of one note. And he joked saying that that note is made by Mr. Steinway, the piano that he's playing, but by the sonority that he can create between the two notes. He also writes in his method of interpretation that are those nuances that are the one that the interpreter need to grasp. Is in the small space between the sound that lies the secret of the sound. I think that this attention on the connection between the notes and this need for a great connection with the instrument and sound are the two elements in common with the approach of Miguel Llobet.
Y no diré, no buscar una sonoridad de una nota, o sea, un timbre, porque esto es cuestión del señor Steinway más pronto. Pero es la sonoridad que se crea entre una y otra nota. O sea, mejor la sonoridad que se crea entre el paso de dos notas. Y esto lo he trabajado mucho y...
Es un poco como la frontera, ¿no?
Sí, sí.
La raya fronteriza de una nota a otra nota.
Sí, sí.
Ese punto de la fusión.
En el momento que una nota que ha dado ya el máximo, lo preciso de lo suyo, empieza a darla a la siguiente nota.
Traspasa
sí.
El testigo.
Y encontrar justo preciso este momento.
Qué maravilla, además que bien lo dice usted.
I think that this attention to the connection of the sound, of the space between the sound, and this great connection with the instrument are two elements in common with the approach of Miguel Llobet. At the end of this first part, I will play for you a recording of Llobet. Despite the recording quality, I think that it's easy to perceive how the performer was searching the right connection to the notes. There is always something that is helpful for the expression of the piece. I think that the guitar is a great instrument to practice this focus on the space between the notes, because it's a light instrument and he reacts very easily to our to everything we do. In particular, the instrument that Llobet was using, like Torres, or if we think about some Catalan luthier like Garcia and Simplicio, are instruments that are so sensible and where it's possible to do so much between the notes. And the music of Mompou and Llobet are perfect composition to try to train this ability of connecting the notes. In particular, in their folk songs, where the nostalgic element is really strong and is created exactly in the space between the notes. This one is something that is very clear in singing, but need to be as clear as possible also in the instrumental music. So I think that this effort to try to enter in this poetic view of the sound and interpretation is the only way for us to really discover the beauty and the complexity of their work. Thank you.